Hi, my name is Jack Mendolia and I work for a firm called Watson and Associates. We were hired to help the board with the school boundary review that they're conducting for all their schools in the city of Oshawa. There are a lot of schools involved and a lot of moving parts, and the school board thought it would be helpful to do some short videos for each school community to explain why the board is doing a citywide boundary review in Oshawa and how it might impact their school communities.
So before we get into some of the data and scenarios specific to Monsignor Paul Dwyer, I just want to take a minute to talk a little bit about the process, maybe some things to expect in terms of next steps, and in a minute or two to just talk about why a school board undertakes a boundary review and some of the conditions that are typically present.
The material that is being presented is based on options that the Board of Trustees agreed to have staff take to the community for input. These are not the final recommendations, but really are intended to provide potential options for your input and feedback. The committee, made up of various board staff, school principals, and a school council representative from each school, will review the feedback and then prepare final recommendations. Those recommendations will be brought back to all of Oshawa via virtual meeting on May 4th, 2023. So why does a school board do a school boundary review or an attendance area review? Well, there's a variety of reasons why a board might conduct a review. Right now, we're going to explore some of the main ones. One of the primary reasons is enrollment pressures, and that means when the enrollment at a school is significantly over what that school was built for. And a school board looks at boundary reviews or changing those boundaries as a way to try to alleviate that enrollment. Again, assuming there are schools close by or somewhat close by that can take that additional enrollment. The other reason why a board might consider a boundary review is when a new school opens. If that new school requires a new boundary and it impacts some of the existing schools, again, a boundary review may be necessary to determine what that new school's boundary will look like. Another reason is an enrollment imbalance, similar to the first point about enrollment pressures. A school board may have some schools that are significantly over capacity. They may have some schools that are under capacity, and they may need to just try to better balance or equalize enrollment for those various schools. And then the last one is program. So if a board has, for example, a French immersion program, and they are looking to either expand that program or offer it in a different way or change the boundaries of that program, that's another reason why a school board might do a boundary review. In the case of this review, and like I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, it's a citywide review, fairly complex, a lot of schools involved. And the other thing is that all of these things, all of these reasons about why a school board might do a boundary review are present in some form in the City of Oshawa review.
So on this next slide, what we're looking at are some of the enrollments associated with the schools under review. What this table shows is all the elementary and secondary schools that are involved in the boundary review. The OTG column that you see here is actually referring to on-the-ground capacity. So it's what the board's or what the school's permanent capacity is, what it was built and designed for. Bricks and mortar space only, doesn't include temporary spaces like portables. Then you see all the enrollments from JK to grade 8, total enrollments, and the last column shows the utilization rate of that school, which is simply the total enrollment relative to the capacity expressed in a percentage rate. And one thing that we see when we look at the elementary and secondary schools is there's quite a variance. There's schools that are operating well above capacity, some schools that are operating at capacity, and a couple of schools that are operating below capacity. On the secondary panel, we look specifically at Monsignor Paul Dwyer at the bottom there. It was built with a capacity, this is the existing school, not the new proposed school or the new approved school. The existing school has a capacity of 811. It currently has enrollment based on October 31st, 2022 headcount enrollment of 983. It results in a utilization rate of about 120% or just a touch over. What we're looking at on this next slide is really just to give you a sense of what the elementary school boundaries look like in the city of Oshawa, and I'll describe a little bit about why that's important to secondary. When we think about secondary schools, typically their boundary is made up of the elementary schools that feed into it. So if we sort of focus on Monsignor Dwyer Most of the schools, or the elementary schools that feed into it, are located in central and north Oshawa. So really the feeder schools where we think about Dwyer's boundary, it's Sir Robert Love, St. Christopher, St. Joseph, St. Kateri, St. John, and St. Anne. This next slide, similar to what we just looked at, it still continues to focus on the school boundaries. But what we've done is we've created a bit of a heat map here based on the utilization of permanent space. And really what you're looking at is anywhere that you see sort of these orangey or dark orange or red colors indicate schools that are over capacity. Anywhere you see some of these green colors, schools are pretty much at capacity. And some of these cooler blue colors would indicate that schools are below capacity. One thing we start to see is there seems to be a pretty clear definition, largely because of a lot of the residential growth that's occurred and still expected to occur in North Oshawa. We see a bit of a delineation here between some of these central and south schools that are either at or below capacity, and some of these central and north schools that are operating in some cases well above capacity.
The scenarios considered for part of this review really fall into a few main categories. The first one is school boundary changes. So we're talking about a traditional school boundary change where we look at moving the line to either make the boundary larger or smaller. The second is grade structure changes. So the new approved Monsignor Paul Dwyer Secondary School has been approved as a grade 7 to 12 school. So as part of this review, the board is interested in hearing from the community about possibly which grade 7 and 8 from which schools should go to the new secondary school. And the third main part of this review had to deal with French immersion programming. As we talked about previously, there's currently 3 dual track French immersion schools. So we looked at a diverse set of options all the way from status quo, leaving it as it is, to 1 single track facility for the whole city, multiple single track facilities, combinations of single track and dual track. So really all options were considered.
So we're going to finish off today's presentation talking a little bit about how some of the scenarios that we brought out to the public and started to consider specifically impact Monsignor Paul Dwyer High School. So both options that are considered that have an impact on the school are very much the same or very much similar, with just with a couple of details that we'll get into that are different. And really when we're talking about these options for consideration, they're really dealing with the new approved school that's going to open rather than the existing school that's going to close. So what we've done is a couple of things. What we're looking at is mostly to deal with the grade 7 and 8s. So the new approved Dwyer that's going to open has been approved as a grade 7 to 12 secondary facility, which means it would accommodate grade 9 to 12 secondary enrollment as well as grade 7 and 8 elementary enrollment. The school has been planned with an on-the-ground capacity of 250 for that grade 7 and 8 portion. So as part of this review, the board wanted to look at options about which elementary schools, grade 7 and 8s, would be viable and reasonable to direct to Paul Dwyer. And again, this is something that the board really wants to engage the public with and hear some feedback on. So in the first option that we looked at sending grade 7 and 8s from St. John Bosco and St. Kateri, two of the elementary schools I spoke about with high utilizations in North Oshawa, and send the 7 and 8s to Paul Dwyer. Number one, to reduce the enrollment pressures at the elementary schools, but also to use that grade 7 and 8 purpose-built space that's expected to be in the new secondary school. So what does it do? Well, it seems to fit fairly well in the short to midterm. Right now, there's about 194 grade 7 and 8s from those 2 elementary schools that you can see here. And then that increases as that growth comes online that we spoke about, up to a little over 250 by 26-27. So a little bit over that 100% utilization. And then as growth continues, enrollments are expected to hit close to 320, which would result in about 130% utilization. At St. John Bosco, removing the grade 7 and 8s would take utilization rates down from 108% to under 80% to allow some room for this future growth that's going to occur. And at St. Kateri, it would reduce utilization rates by a little over 20%, from 162% to 141%. On the next slide, again, from a Monsignor Paul Dwyer perspective, no change. The only thing that this option is looking at is instead of it being St. John Bosco and St. Kateri, this option looks at instead removing St. Kateri from that mix and it being St. John Bosco and St. Anne grade 7 and 8s that are sent over to Dwyer. Again, the only difference from Dwyer's perspective is that with the Bosco and Kateri configuration, there's slightly less grade 7 and 8s, so the utilization rates are a touch lower at Dwyer. With the Bosco and configuration, you can see that utilization rates get up to about 107% in the midterm of the forecast, and then upwards of 130% at the end of the forecast. So what does this mean for the Paul Dwyer community, or at least the new Paul Dwyer community, the new secondary approved school? Again, both are pretty much the same. Approximately 117 students in both cases from Bosco, grade 7 and 8s that would go. In option 1, it'd be just under 80 students from St. Kateri, Tekakwitha. In option 2, it would be about 130 plus students from St. Anne. And before we get off some of these options and implications specific to Paul Dwyer, probably important to spend a minute just talking about the existing Paul Dwyer as well and how it plays into some of the possible options for consideration. So in one or a couple of options, the board is considering looking at the possibility of a single track French immersion facility for the entire city of Oshawa. So right now, the board has 3 dual track French immersion schools, which means the school offers both English and French immersion programming. And under that consideration, the board is examining whether it might make sense to have one single track facility to operate French immersion for the entire city of Oshawa. Under that consideration or scenario so far, it's the existing Paul Dwyer that has been highlighted as a potential opportunity to accommodate that single track French immersion. The school is fairly centrally located in Oshawa, and it has sufficient capacity to accommodate both the existing number of French immersion students as well as what we project that French immersion population to look like in the future.
To finish off tonight's presentation, I just want to talk a little bit about what we've heard so far from the Oshawa community. So we've had a couple of community level meetings. We've had some committee level meetings. We've had a couple of surveys that have gone out to the public, as well as feedback that can be provided to the board through a general email address. And from that feedback, there's a couple of things that are starting to come from it. One thing that we're starting to hear is that there seems to be a preference for single track French immersion programming. There seems to be a preference for 2 facilities in the city of Oshawa rather than 1. When I want specifically with regard to single track French immersion programming. A lot of the feedback wants to see a reduction in this enrollment pressure that we spoke about. There is a concern or a consideration to try as much as we can to keep communities together. And the public also wants us to consider with regard to any changes that might be made, what transportation implications there are, how long students might be on a bus for. When we look at one question that we were asked, or that we asked the community early on in the process, what are some of the initial issues you see with some of the existing conditions at your school? You can see that about 50%, a little bit over 50% of the responses are either enrollment pressures or too many portables. So I think there's a clear understanding in the community that there's schools that are operating above capacity, and that something needs to be done to deal with some of that enrollment pressure. And that's why the board is undergoing this boundary review. So I appreciate you taking the time to watch this video tonight. I hope you found it informative, but if there are any questions, we will continue to reach out to the community. A lot of information can be found on the board's website and a couple of meetings coming up. Thank you.